Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Women in Streaming Media Education Podcast. Now, I'm particularly excited about today's episode because not only do we have an amazing guest because of her work within the industry, but she is also part of the Women in Streaming Media's board. I'm very pleased to have Florence Agboma, who is Head of Speaker Engagement for Women in Streaming Media, but she is also Senior Product Manager for Video Experience at Sky. She has over 17 years of experience in the streaming industry, consumer-facing products, and she specialises in driving video experiences, optimising streaming performances, and driving strategic innovations in the OTT delivery chain. Florence earned her PhD in Computing and Electronic Systems from the University of Essex and has authored numerous technical publications on streaming video in leading journals and conference proceedings, which makes her an excellent candidate for leading our speaker engagements. She also, on top of this, works on the Low Latency Streaming Working Group for Streaming Video Technology Alliance. And that is primarily what she will be discussing with us today. So that work on low latency for SVTA. So thank you so much for joining us today, Florence. It is fantastic to have you here on the podcast.
Thank you, Polly, for having me. I am fantastic. I'd rather be nowhere else than doing this with you right now. I'm thrilled.
Thank you, and we are thrilled to have you, one of our own on the podcast. So I was just going to kind of start off by saying I am sure we've got quite a range of listeners to this podcast. So it might be worth just sort of starting off by explaining, what the low latency SVTA working group is and kind of what you're addressing at the moment.
Yeah, sure. Did you know that SVTA, it's 10 years, right? Yeah, 2014, about 17 companies came together to address, the growing technical and operation challenges of delivering high quality video over the internet. So just think about it, 10 years ago, where were we? And that was when SVTA was formed, which is Streaming Video Technology Alliance. And so the SVTA's mission was, rather than boiling the ocean with yet another end-to-end architecture, right, to solve the problem, SVTA focused on making streaming better, right? And it was just focusing on tackling the best practices and the missing piece in what service providers and operators were, deploying. So when you see our publications, you tend to see as best practices because we're trying to address, those gaps. And within SVTAs, there are lots of working groups, even with the merging of the addition of Dash IF, it's just massive, and with newer companies joining and stuff. So we have different working groups, of which the low latency working group is a part of, but we have open caching within SVTA. It's been extremely busy with specifications to enable upstream video providers and CDN partners to leverage downstream edge caches. We have players and playback, working group to focus on using CMCD in terms of getting player analytics. We have the low latency one, which is around, end-to-end measurement of, low latency. That's one of the gaps that we're trying to address, and just trying to understand what is the status quo of what's happening out there in the industry and the different working groups within SVTA. And I'm back to your question. Sorry, I digressed a bit, right? Just wanted to give you a bit of context. And back to your question. And back to your question regarding the main challenges of that the low latency streaming working group is currently addressing. So I've been in the industry for quite a while. I've worked in different aspects of the industry, and I am still surprised that we struggle as an industry to measure glass to glass latency, right? There is no, to my knowledge, there is no single product out there, right, that measures it. It's, if you have, it's either bespoke or you measure a part of it, of that end-to-end chain. And that's one of the key things that we're addressing within the low latency streaming group. How do you measure end-to-end latency? What's the optimal player configurations or the optimal video pipeline optimizations to make low latency streaming happen, and what causes low latency as well, right? And how can you
Yep.
optimize that? So those are the things that we're trying to address within the working group, of which I'm one of the chairs of the low latency working group. I chair it with Michael from Tag Video Systems and Will from Conviva. So three of us chair the low latency working group.
Awesome. It sounds like SVTA in general is doing a whole range of really, really important work. But yeah, certainly when we were coming up with, topics that we were going to cover on this podcast, latency was right up there with what people were really wanting to kind of understand, which again sounds like really, what you're actually working on there is understanding latency to start with. Kind of aside from that, how does the group look at that kind of live streaming experience? And perhaps if we're thinking about traditional broadcast methods, how do those two things kind of compare at this moment?
Traditional methods of low latency, you mean, or?
Well, I suppose in terms of, latency has become an issue since we've ventured away from those traditional methods. So yes. How are you looking at that kind of experience?
Yes. So I think we are at a transition right now. We know that streaming has surpassed broadcast and cable. Like, the data is there, right? And streaming needs to match similar, that experience, or even surpass it, right? Like, and there's a lot of competition in the space, right? In terms of in the streaming space. So some of the things that we're saying, it's when you ask people, right, like, what is latency, right? Like, what is your definition of latency? Like different pockets of like people, having their own different definitions, and some of them would say, oh, for me, latency, it's the delay behind the broadcast, right? Services or broadcast TV, and some would say, actually, no, latency, it's the delay behind what is happening live at the stadium, right? So you tend to have like pockets of people, and people still want to match the broadcast experience, right? But is that the right thing to do? Because I don't know, in some broadcast platforms, you tend to see like at times, additional delays are added intentionally to those streams, purely because you want to give, because it's live, you want to give that time to correct any issues that arise and stuff. So you actually intentionally add delays, right? So does it make sense to match it to that, or does it make sense to be behind the live event happening at the so there's a debate on that, right? I think one thing that's sort of like driving streaming aside the broadcast is the social media space. And one of the pain points that, I mean, as a sports fan, right, it's seeing notifications on my mobile phone from like Twitter, WhatsApp from my friend and stuff like that, before me actually seeing the action happening on the screen, right? So for me, and my personal take on this is, latency should be behind what is happening live, the action at the stadium, at the event, but other people have their own different So we are trying to surpass the broadcast experience, but
Yeah, I think that kind of sporting example is the one that I'm most familiar with as well, particularly in those events like we've had over the last couple of years, where you'll hear the cheer before you've seen the thing. So I think that leads me nicely onto my next question, which is about some of those key areas of best practice that you're looking at, but also you're perhaps proposing for reducing latency, as we kind of we compare to the traditional methods. You're kind of saying, is that right? Is that what we should be doing? If not, what does that best practice actually look like then moving forward?
Yes. So we have the Low Latency Working Group. We have published two documentations, and one is in the process of being reviewed and published. So the first one we did was best practices for reducing live streaming latency, right? So we looked at the whole end to end and see which part of those components within the video pipeline it's contributing more to latency. So whether it's the contribution side, whether it's the packaging, whether it's the player, whether it's the DRM, whether it's the CDN, and from that publication, different components do add delay to that whole, before you see the content playing on your on your device. But the two areas, in my opinion, it's segment length. So if you do like 10 seconds, if you do like 6 seconds, 2 seconds, those would add, latency, more latency to your experience, because the packager has to finish, encoding and packaging that segment duration before anything else can happen, right? And then the other part that we see that contributes to latency, it's the on the player configuration side. So at times some players you have to wait a certain amount of seconds before playback can start, just because you want more reliability and stable streams. Some of them have to wait like 3 segment duration. So those are like the big sort of like areas, and you can really have latency by initially tweaking your segment durations and all of that. So that's the first part. And then there are 2 other technologies that helped to 2 main technologies now, but there are others like in the pipeline in there, like media over quick and all of that. But just referring to the low latency HLS and the low latency dash. So that sort of like uses the principle of not having to wait for the whole segment to be created before you can start playback. So using the stuff like partial segment duration, so you can start playing back before that whole entire 6 seconds segment is actually fully published and stuff. So doing that and some settings on the player means you can start playback like as soon as 2 seconds, but it's always a compromise with reliability and latency, right? Those are the 2. Actually, there's a triangle in there: reliability, latency, and quality. Those are like the 3 things you have to really play with to get that balance.
So it sounds like in that best practice, you're exploring that kind of compromise and what that means. Is that right?
Yes, half and half. But our main goal right now is we have like different projects that we're working on, but our main goal right now, it's how do you measure end-to-end latency, glass to glass, because you cannot improve what you can't measure, right? If we can measure it, we can improve it.
Yeah, absolutely. Otherwise, I mean, how do you even know?
Yes.
Just coming back to that kind of project side of things then, obviously that's your main area of focus at the moment, but are there any kind of other projects or presentations that you can discuss that you've been working on that kind of are feeding into that progress and the findings?
Yeah, so I talked about the first publication that we did, which was what causes latency and stuff. The other one that we've done, it's around exploration on how to measure latency, because there are different ways of measuring latency. And if you go to the SVTA.org website, you would see the publications in there on that, the low latency stuff. And if you're a member, you can download them and read them. So we know how to measure it, right? We know what causes it and all of that. But we have like other things that we are working on, right? So we've not yet. So if you look at the video pipeline, right, and I'm going to really split it into 2 areas, just because it's just simple for me to talk about it. So there are 2 areas. There's the contribution side of the pipeline, and then there's the distribution side of the pipeline, right? And what we've done within the low latency working group, we know how to measure latency for the contribution, and we know how to measure it for the distribution. And the challenge we're trying to solve now is to merge those 2 values into one. Right? It sounds trivial, but so that's one of the things we're trying to do. How do we join those 2 values and just have one, so you can still measure the individual components, the delays that they contribute, but what is that one value, and how does that relate to reliability metrics, quality of experience metrics? So that's one thing. The other thing that we're doing is we are currently in the process of drafting and sending out a survey, an industry survey. And the survey is really about understanding the expectations and challenges for those who know the industry best, right? So publishers, service providers, etc. And we really want to identify practical low latency targets, right? Like, is it 10 seconds behind the live event? Is it 5 seconds behind the live event? Like, what is really, practical to achieve, bearing in mind that triangle of compromise that you have to that you have to do. So there's the survey. We're doing other things within a low latency working group. We're joining. So within the SVTA, we have like a test lab that has the typical components you would have in any streaming environment, which is fantastic within the SVTA. And we have the various components. We have like, transcoders, packages, players, origins, and all of that. And we're working to including some CDNs in there. So which is just great because that just completes, that whole workflow. We have more documentation that we're doing. One of the gaps that we have found from service providers and publishers, we don't really understand like what the optimal settings are for low latency delivery, right? So as part of the low latency working group, we want to publish that to say, these are the optimal player settings, or these are the optimal packaging settings. So people can just pick up those, publications and say, okay, I want to, initiate low latency streaming within my pipeline. How do I do that? Oh, this is this document and this is what I should do.
Awesome. I kind of touched on it there, but I just wanted to kind of explore what collaboration you're doing with maybe other working groups or other areas outside of SVTA. The lab sounds amazing, and also that kind of research part, because I think it's all very well and good having the technical, but if we don't understand the industry, then these two things can't sit in silo. So I feel like collaboration is a huge important part of this story as well.
Indeed, and you just hit the nail right in, Polly. You just did. I'm a big sucker for collaboration, and I think it's something that we need to do more within the SVTA, even just as a start, right? Within the SVTA working groups, we should collaborate more with the QoE working group. We should collaborate more with the networking working group. We should collaborate more with the streaming video operations working group, all within SVTA, right? So it's maybe that is a challenge for 2025. Like, how do we collaborate more, and also how do we leverage Dash IF that's now part of SVTA, right? It's that's more work to be done. That's more work on collaboration.
Well, I think that's been quite a theme in some of the recent conferences as well. We've heard collaboration and partnerships, really being a bit of a trend. And actually, I think that's really positive that we're talking about that and saying that is something that we should do, because I think there's been a bit of a history of us working in those small groups on our own thing and not collaborating. And perhaps some of those methods have made it a bit more challenging for us now. So, looking forward, I love that as a 2025 goal. Let's do it. Yes. More collaboration.
Yes. And I think that's what the SVTA is really geared and set up for, because like, if you're anyone in the industry, like, I don't know, SVTA has got like, I don't know, over 100 like members, like different companies and stuff, like, like that's a lot to come into to collaborate. But I think what is even more interesting for SVTA, watch this space, right? So I'm not sure who actually mentioned this to me, like the way SIMT, right, is to broadcast, right? That is the same way SVTA is going to be to streaming, right? Because it has like all of those companies in there coming in to make streaming better by collaborating. So watch this space on that one. I'm really excited about that. Really.
Awesome. Just moving away from kind of industry specific for our final question. Obviously, at the end of the day, everything that we're doing is for the consumer, the person at at home, or not even at home anymore because they're probably watching something on their mobile phone. How do you kind of think that the work that you're doing within this group, and particularly on, we touched on it at the start, with the comparison of traditional experiences and things, but how do you think this work is going to impact the future of live streaming, and therefore the future of that viewer experience?
Yes. So this is the one, right? So
it's a big question. As I was saying, I was thinking that's a big one to answer.
yeah. This is the one. Just specifically narrowing it down to the low latency working group, right? So one of the things we've been asking ourselves, and it's still one of the projects within this group, is there really a business case for low latency, right? Like, can you charge for it? Like, can you make revenue for it? So it's an open question. But I think one of the things that we would see more of, there is more competition. And it could be like a value added, thing you can have, like, say, and you could use that to talk about the competition market, and stuff. But it's really, we have to think about what is the goalpost now, right? I personally don't think the goalpost is broadcast, right? I think the goalpost should be user getting the notifications. It should be social media. It should be, I want to be as close to the live event, happening. I think that's the goalpost. And I think one of the things that we are helping to solve, it's how do you get reliable end-to-end measurement? So effectively having a low latency metric that you could track as any other QE metrics. Yeah,
awesome. I think it's going to be an exciting year in your working group, but also in how this kind of progresses. As we know, things in the streaming world progress super fast. So I just wanted to thank you for coming onto the podcast and exploring these super important topics. Really kind of interesting to, I think, progress that conversation around the comparison between the traditional methods and where we're going, but also kind of the work that you're doing and how that's going to feed into the future. The future looking hopefully a bit more collaborative, and always, of course, with our users and our consumers in mind, and their changing perspectives as well, because I think what you said there about kind of keeping up with the social media angle is really, really key. And we know that from the data released recently that the viewer is changing into a different demographic. So really interesting, and thank you so much for kind of delivering this. Don't forget, you can read all about this as well in our blog, which accompanies these podcasts. So if you want to get a bit more, I'm hoping that we're going to get some diagrams in there. I'd love to see some of the diagrams of what Florence was talking about there, but really appreciate you tuning into the podcast, and look forward to seeing however you're consuming this for the next one. Thank you, Florence.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Polly.